today's workshop. Um, I, I feel I technically need to repeat actually the fire evacuation instructions, because for those who were here yesterday, I did my dutiful, like, this is the fire evacuation instruction, and then the actual fire alarm went off. Proper one, so they all go outside. So fire is go outside, down the hallway in that direction, down the big stairs, and then out, or follow somebody who did it yesterday. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Arjun, who'll be talking about Mereology of Pregnancy and the Immune System.
Thank you very much. I am so excited to be here. It's probably the first conference that I presented at where people know, are interested in, and care about the mereology of pregnancy. So it's amazing. So thank you for having me. This is, as the title suggests, a thesis about the mereology of pregnancy, but specifically according to the immune system. There is some interesting and one horrifying image of a fetus. So just to warn you, this isn't the horrifying one. So I'm going to just quickly go over the kind of background to this project, which we heard about a little bit yesterday. And then some of the kind of basic assumptions that I'm not going to argue for, I'm just going to take from kind of standard immunology. And then there'll be some interesting diagrams of the different mereological options. And then I present two arguments. One is a kind of empirical argument based on the immune interactions between the gestator and fetus during pregnancy, and based on the assumptions that I use, how we go from those facts to some kind of mereological conclusion. And then I give another kind of just logical argument from mereology to support that conclusion. And then I conclude. So some terms which we probably are already familiar with, but these I take from Kingma's papers to keep it kind of consistent with her use of the terms, so we're all talking about the same things. So gravida is a pregnant organism. So it's an organism which is gestating a fetus. A foster is a kind of generic term for anything that the gravida is pregnant with. So anything from a zygote all the way up to a fetus about to be born counts as a foster. In this presentation, I'm focusing on pregnancy from implantation onwards. And that's mainly because prior to implantation, there's actually very little empirical work on what happens. For obvious reasons, doing in vivo research on zygotes floating around in fallopian tubes, very difficult to do. So in 2018, we're presented with this enigmatic incendiary statement from Elsa and Kingma, which is that the embryo fetus is not merely contained by or inside the maternal organism, but is a part of that maternal organism. Fetuses are literally lady parts. Right, so the merely and the literally are doing a lot of work. So there are sort of three papers, but the main one that I focus on is a paper from 2009, which is where she more or less responds to an argument originally presented by Smith and Brogard, which is that the fetus is merely contained by the maternal organism, like a bun in the oven, a tub of yogurt in a fridge. And Kingma's central claim is that that's wrong. It's not only Smith and Brogard's view, but sort of the standard lay view of pregnancy. And Kingma claims that no, the foster is a proper part of the gravida. By proper part, I mean a part that does not include the whole. So in the rest of the talk, I'm just going to use part to mean proper part, and I'll use overlap to mean proper overlap, which is again, overlap which isn't complete overlap. There are some like diagrams halfway through the talk to make this all a bit clearer. And Kingma establishes her parthood claim by examining the physiological features of pregnancy. Specifically, she looks at the metabolism, the anatomical relations between foster and gravida, and the immunology of pregnancy. And the immunological model that she uses comes from Thomas Pradou, mainly set out in a book in 2012, but also in subsequent papers, notably one in 2016. And in that, Pradou argues that the immune system with its surveillance activity defines what is accepted or rejected by the organism. A criterion of immunogenicity thus constitutes a criterion of inclusion, the distinction between entities that are interconnected and form a whole as constituents of the organism, and those that are rejected is carried out by the immune system. So apropos kind of getting this conversation off the ground, what Kingma sort of does, though she doesn't explicitly state that that's what she's doing, is start out with some kind of principle of composition for organisms. In this case, we're using an immunological principle. And then from that, looking at the gravida and the foster, arguing that the foster should be counted as part of the gravida, or that the foster and whatever is gestating the foster compose a single organism. So in immunology, so I'm broadly within the Pradou universe, but I take two basic assumptions from immunology, which are more or less universally accepted within the field. So the first is that the immune system of an organism tolerates all and only the parts of the organism to which that immune system belongs, and I will unpack that in a minute. And so we get from immune tolerance to claims about parthood. And the other thing that I use, which Pradou does not specifically claim, is that all parts of the organism are compatible with at least some parts of the immune system. And again, I'll explain why we need this assumption for a sensible view. So for the first one, so Pradou himself says any entity which interacts regularly with the immune system and is not eliminated by it is part of the physiological individual. We have kind of the big names in immunology as well. Burnett in 1959 said it is axiomatic that no immunological reaction takes place against the normal constituents of the body. And from claims like this, we get this idea that the immune system only tolerates parts of the organism. And so wherever there is immune rejection, we get destruction of the thing that the immune system rejects. So everything that is left in the resting physiological state of the organism is immune tolerance. And the immune system is also, a collection of different stuff, right? So it's tissues, cells, barriers, all of which also interact with each other. So the immune system is self-tolerant. It interacts with itself and tolerates itself. And so from this, we get a principle whereby you can kind of start from the bottom up, looking at the individual constituent parts of the immune system, looking at what kind of relations they have to each other, and deciding whether or not these different parts constitute wholes, and work your way slowly up until you get this picture of an organism. The idea of immune compatibility is slightly different and mainly comes from transplantation medicine. So within immunology, one of the big kind of drivers for immune theory is experiments in transplant medicine. And it is no exaggeration to say that some of the defining principles of immunology come from transplantation. transplants of one organ from one organism to another are invariably rejected by the recipient, right? So you cannot get an organ donation without taking immune suppression, pretty much ever. There are some interesting exceptions. But by immune compatibility, I mean, if something were to come into contact with the immune system would tolerate it only if it's compatible with that immune system. So this is a counterfactual claim. And it comes from transplantation medicine. But if we just take that, right? So we say all kind of foreign transplants are rejected by the immune system, all kind of transplants from one part of the body to another will be accepted. We might get a principle like all parts of the organism are compatible with all parts of the immune system, right? So you can take any part from any part of your body and move it somewhere else. You can transplant your hand onto your forehead, and that would work. I don't know why you would do that, but you could. But we run into a problem because there are some things that can only be tolerated or will only be tolerated in some parts of the body. So pregnancy is one of the standard examples where a fetus is only really immunologically tolerated or tolerated in the right way to facilitate implantation and pregnancy in the uterus. Can't do it anywhere else. The more kind of common example is bacteria. So we have lots of bacteria in our gut, and the immune system in the gut recognizes those bacteria and will tolerate them, actually facilitates them, colonizing the gut, the skin, and all other kind of interfaces with the environment. But those bacteria can't go anywhere else. If they move from the gut into the bloodstream, they will be rejected by the immune system. So the immune system is context sensitive, but it is still nevertheless the case that transplants from one organism to another are rejected. So we soften the principle by saying all parts of the organism are compatible with at least some parts of the immune system, right? If something is incompatible with all parts of the immune system, then it is safe to say that that is not part of the organism. So that's the two kind of basic principles that are going to give us our mereological conclusions. And so Kingma's argument is reasonably simple. The foster is tolerated by the gravida under normal conditions. Right? It is recognized by the immune system of the gravida. The gravida's immune system does not reject the foster. Anything which is accepted by the immune system is part of the organism. The foster is accepted by the immune system of the gravida. The foster is part of the gravida. Except there's more. So one option that Kingma does not specifically contemplate, at least in her papers, is that there are actually more options than containment and parthood. There is a third option, which is overlap. And Suki Finn was the first person to notice that in writing. Alex Geddes has also written a paper about how Kingma's physiological arguments are at least consistent with overlap. And this is overlap on the extreme right. The first one is the foster, which is blue. It's apart and inside the spatiotemporal region of the gravida, which is red. The second one, there's a kind of white margin around. So the gravida is like a donut, roughly speaking. And inside the donut, we have this blue foster, but they're disjoint entities. They can even be opposing each other, so they can be touching each other, but essentially you can't mereologically fuse them. And in the third case, we've got overlap where a part of the foster is part of the gravida and a part of the gravida is part of the foster, but they're still two entities which overlap. So on to the immunology. Right? So the immune system, and so I think any mereological view of pregnancy, according to the immune system at least, should account for some important immune features of pregnancy, right? So one of them is that the immune system of the foster and gravida form a contiguous, connected system, right? So the immune system of the foster and the immune system of the gravida notice each other, interact with each other, and their activity and behaviors are modulated because of this interaction, right? And this goes against containment. So insofar as we think that anything tolerated by the immune system is part of that thing which is tolerating it, at least part of the foster is going to be part of the gravida. It can't be merely contained by the gravida. The other important thing to mention is that the gravida's immune system recognizes specific molecular markers on the surface of the implanting blastocyst. So this is a stage in the development of the foster where it implants. And it notices that this blastocyst is not just some other uterine cell. Also notices that it is not a bacterium, it's not a virus. It's specifically designed to recognize fosters. And when it recognizes a foster, it is set up to facilitate implantation. This is a specific evolved mechanism which suggests that the uterus at that point recognizes and must recognize that this is something else, right? So at this point, it has to notice that a separate entity that is not part of itself has arrived. And it then proceeds to implant it, right? So this is against parthood, but sort of. Because subsequent to this recognition, you could argue that the gravida then proceeds to make the foster a part of itself. But there's a stronger argument to be made, which is that, okay, after implantation, there is immune tolerance of some parts of the foster, but there are parts of the foster which are not tolerated by the gravida. A, because the gravida's immune system never gets there. So these are inaccessible to the immune system of the gravida. And also they are incompatible. So if the gravida's immune system did notice these parts of the foster, it would destroy it. And there is empirical research to support both of those claims. So we will go through them one by one. And while these kind of features are against containment and against parthood, all of them are consistent with overlap. So my argument is that there is only one option available insofar as the immune system is our guide on these matters, and that is overlap. There's no other consistent mereology. There's no other mereological view which is consistent with immunology. So I'm not going to do molecular markers, but the immune system has three kind of rough phases. The phase one is pro-inflammatory. So the immune system in this stage is galvanized into some kind of activity. Lots of immune cells are drawn to the site of implantation. If you looked at it under a microscope, it looks very similar to immune rejection. And classically, this finding was interpreted as a kind of conflict between foster and gravida, though we now have a more nuanced understanding of what's going on. The second phase is anti-inflammatory. So all of this kind of these pro-inflammatory mediators are dampened down and regulated so that this inflammatory kind of phase reduces and allows the foster to kind of grow and develop until labor, which is again pro-inflammatory. So all of these inflammatory markers then upregulated again, but in this time, it does in fact look pretty much like immune rejection. And this facilitates the placenta detaching from the uterus. So in the, well, I said no immunology, but when the foster first interacts with the uterine wall, it initiates this pro-inflammatory phase, right? So the foster presents molecular markers that mark it out as another human cell or group of cells distinct from the gravida's own cells. In the same way that if you had like a kidney transplant from someone else, your immune system would recognize those same histocompatibility markers. But in your case, your immune system would proceed to reject it. So it's a mystery, or at least it was a mystery, why this doesn't happen in the case of the gravida. But also, as early as 3 to 4 weeks, the foster also has immune cells. Right? These are early kind of just developing immune cells, but they also interact with the uterine immune system, and they regulate the interactions across the boundary between the placenta and the uterine wall. So they down-regulate or they suppress all of this kind of pro-inflammatory mediators to get a kind of more quiescent immune state. And this was traditionally kind of interpreted as the foster suppressing the immune system of the gravida. But that isn't entirely consistent with a lot of empirical findings because the immunology of pregnancy is a result of a combination, a very complex combination of signals and responses that originate from the maternal immune system and the fetal placental immune system, which leads to a modulated immune system in the gravida. Right? So traditionally, we thought that pregnant women were more prone to infections while pregnant because the foster was suppressing their immune system. There's a lot of kind of very inconsistent findings in the literature, and that is thought now to be because different phases of pregnancy are associated with different immune modulation. It also makes no sense for a pregnant woman to be more susceptible to infection because this is an important state which would decrease fitness. So this suggests that the immune system of at least suggests that the immune system of the gravida and foster are interacting with each other, and the state of the responsiveness and the dispositional profile of the immune system of the gravida and the foster are modulated by this interaction. So they seem to be connected and mutually interactive in a way that is similar to the way that the immune system in the brain interacts with the immune system outside the brain, the immune system in the kidney interacts with the immune system outside the kidney. So they all just form one kind of contiguous network. For implantation specifically, right, the foster is not the same species, is the same species as the gravida. So the model that people used around immunology of implantation was a transplantation model, which predicts that the foster will be rejected by the gravida because it's of the same species, it's being kind of transplanted into the uterus. And there were various kind of explanations for why this is not the case. Normally not the case, should not be the case. But it is clear that the foster is being recognized as something other than another uterine cell. because when implantation occurs, a very specific immune reaction then follows. So the immune system of the gravida starts to destroy its own uterine lining, destroys the cells, destroys blood vessels, creates pools of blood, which the placenta, which then invades into and kind of has these little finger-like projections that float freely in these pools of blood. But the immune system of the gravida turns on itself. And the foster is not destroyed as a part of this immune reaction, even though it has triggered it. So this is, on the one hand, not immune rejection, because the thing that is triggering the immune response is not being destroyed, but it's not immune tolerance in the passive sense of the word either. This is immune remodeling, right? So immune triggered inflammatory remodeling of the uterine lining, which allows the foster to implant. And so the kind of natural interpretation of this is that the immune system of the gravida recognizes that the foster is a foster, a individual of the same species, but not the same individual as the gravida. And then it proceeds to facilitate implantation. So it proceeds to then make at least part of this other individual a part of itself. But only part of the foster receives this treatment, right? So during the second phase of pregnancy, a number of immune regulatory mechanisms are employed to dampen the inflammatory response and allow growth and maturation of the foster. Alex Geddes points out that there are parts of the foster which never come into contact with the gravida's immune system. And so at best, we cannot then claim that those parts of the foster are tolerated by the immune system of the gravida, because tolerance requires some form of immune recognition. But there's a strong argument to be made, which is based on this notion of compatibility, because we know from kind of empirical work, experiments, pathological cases, where those parts which do not come into contact with the immune system of the gravida are shielded from it by both anatomical and physiological barriers, because they are incompatible. So in the same way that a child cannot donate their kidneys to their mother without their mother's immune system rejecting those kidneys, we don't do that with fetuses, but the molecular markers are the same. And the implication is that fetal kidneys cannot be transplanted into a maternal organism. The most kind of common example of this is blood type incompatibility. So the rhesus blood type is a Mendelian recessive, based on a recessive gene. So a mother can be rhesus negative because she's got one rhesus positive, or two rhesus negatives. Father could be rhesus positive. The fetus is then rhesus positive. So you get a rhesus positive fetus in a rhesus negative mother. If some blood from the foster escapes into the maternal circulation, the gravida forms antibodies against the rhesus antigen. Antibodies do cross the placenta. These antibodies then cause destruction of fetal blood cells, hemolysis. And so this causes what is known as hemolytic disease of the newborn. It can cause fetal death. If it doesn't cause fetal death, it causes severe anemia in newborns, which usually is also fatal. And so what we now do in medicine is, if there is this blood type incompatibility, mothers are given antibodies against the antibodies against the rhesus antigens. So there are important treatments that we have because we recognize that this is a risk. But what this all implies is that, yes, part of the foster, specifically that part which directly interacts with the immune system of the gravida, is tolerated by the immune system of the gravida. But there are all sorts of things inside the interior of the foster where the gravida's immune system doesn't go. And it doesn't go there because those parts of the immune system, those parts of the foster are incompatible with the immune system of the gravida. They would trigger the formation of antibodies, and those antibodies would trigger immune rejection, which we don't want during pregnancy. So if the immune system of an organism tolerates all and only the parts of the organism to which the immune system belongs, and all parts of the organism are compatible with at least some parts of the immune system, then part of the foster seems to qualify as part of the gravida because it is tolerated by the immune system of the gravida. But there are some parts of the foster which are incompatible with all parts of the gravida and are therefore not part of the gravida. Part of the foster, part of the gravida, part of the foster, not part of the gravida. There's only one mereological option left on the table, which is overlap. There's if we're not happy with that, there is another argument which Geddes hit me to the post on, which is the argument from symmetry, right? So we know that the gravida has an immune system which tolerates the foster, but the foster also has an immune system from pretty early on, and it tolerates the gravida and must do so. So the immune relation between foster and gravida is a symmetrical one. But proper parthood is anti-symmetrical. So if A is a proper part of B, then B cannot be a proper part of A. Right? The immune system of the gravida tolerates at least part of the foster. The foster also has an immune system, and this tolerates at least part of the gravida. If the foster is part of the gravida, then by the same logic, the gravida would also be part of the foster, which would be absurd. I mean, Trinitarian metaphysics aside. But if the foster overlaps with the gravida, this is a symmetrical relation because the gravida also overlaps with the foster. Yay, that works. So this is an AI generated image of a foster. So if you type in foster gestata overlap, you get horrendous Halloween themed results. Right. So I have argued that the immune system of an organism tolerates all and only the parts of the organism to which that immune system belongs, which is a generally accepted principle within immunology. And all parts of the organism are compatible with at least some parts of the immune system. If we accept both of those things, and we ought to, if insofar as we are taking the immune system to be our guide on mereology in organisms, then the immune system of the gravida and foster form contiguous networks, so we should reject the containment view. The immune system of the gravida only tolerates and is compatible with only part of the foster, so we should reject the part view. And the immune system between the foster and the gravida is symmetrical, so that's another reason to reject the part view. And so the overlap view becomes the only view consistent with all of these findings. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Arjun. That was great. So I have a few different things that I want to push you on.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. So the first thing is the blood-brain barrier limits the entry of immune cells and cell mediators into the central nervous system, which means that by your account, my own brain is incompatible with my immune system. In the same way as you say that because the fetus is partly shielded from the maternal immune system, it therefore isn't properly compatible with the maternal immune system and therefore can't be a proper part. So I feel like my brain definitely is a proper part of my body, even if it's not compatible with my immune system. So I feel like that counterexample causes a problem immediately for for your account. So thoughts on that? And the other thing that, if it's okay to shoehorn more questions in, is a slightly vaguer concern, which is that, you're looking at Purdue and Burnett and these people who talk about immunological tolerance, but it's quite a lot of the literature on things like cancer and pregnancy and immune response are using maternal fetal toleration interchangeably with other terms like the immune permissive environment or immune suppressive mechanisms. And I wonder if, rather than kind of saying, oh, well, this isn't strict toleration, that we couldn't also just go in the other direction and say some versions of toleration specific to the pretty unique phenomenon of pregnancy are kinds of suppressive mechanisms. So why say that this is suppression, not toleration, rather than suppression is a form of toleration that accommodates the specific phenomenon of pregnancy? And I have more, but I'm going to stop there for now.
Okay, good. Yeah. So with the blood-brain barrier, the first thing to say is it's not the same, right? So if you get encephalitis, meningitis, the immune system from your blood will go into your brain to fight those infections. So there is much more passage across. You can disrupt the blood-brain barrier and you won't reject your brain, right? So the brain is not shielded from the immune system in the peripheral blood. It has its own specialized immune system in the same way that the liver has its own specialized immune system and the gut has its own specialized immune system. But immune cells can cross the blood-brain barrier. Immune cells cannot cross the placenta and should not, because you will get fetal loss. So those are different. Yeah.
Like cross the placental barrier. That's where the people get it from the mother. So what do you mean by that? Can't cross the placenta? As far as abilities are from the blood,
We can discuss the literature, but as far as I am aware, no.
They can't cross the placenta, T cells.
It's T cells.
T cell, because you said that
Yeah.
T cells can cross the placenta and migrate into the fetus, right? No, it's not,
They don't.
it's impossible.
As far as
Because there are-
I am aware,
Amniotic
don't.
sac, the fetus is enclosed in an amniotic sac, and the lymphocytes cannot migrate, between. I mean, there may be minor seeding by maternal cells, including the T cells, but it's not like a kind of transfer of immune cells. This is called microchimerism, the transfer of maternal cells. And among these cells, there may be incidentally some immune cells, but it's not like a kind of stream of immune cells coming from mother to the fetus to, to help with immunity or something like that. So yes, there is a transfer of maternal cells to the fetus that stay even after birth, and the other way around, of course. So this is the microchimerism, but it's not like
I didn't really mention microchimerism. There's a whole thing about that, but again, there are special reasons why microchimerism is allowed in this particular case. But the other thing that you mentioned was immune suppression and immune tolerance. But the thing that really does the work here is intolerance, right? So the thing that separates the part view and the overlap view is the idea that there are some parts of the fetus which are not compatible and not tolerated, right? So that grounds the claim that there are some parts of the fetus which are not part of the gravida. And if that's true, and some parts of the fetus are part of the gravida, that's what grounds the claim of overlap, right? So how we specifically cash out the notion of tolerance, and tolerance is an umbrella term for a lot of different things, in the same way that immune rejection and immune tolerance is a false dichotomy. The idea that there are parts of the immune system which should not go into the foster because that bit of the foster would be destroyed by said bits of the immune system is reasonably well established empirically.
Thank you so much, Arjun. I really like your talk, and I'm familiar with your paper on the immune system and pregnancy. It's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. But I have like two questions. So one question is, like, you insist that some part of the fetus, some parts of the fetus are not tolerated by the maternal immune system. So I would like you to please explicate which parts are these specifically that are not tolerated. And the second question, I guess, maybe it's a bit like, I can imagine that there may be different kinds of overlap between, let's say, the mother and the fetus. So maybe, you know, one type of overlap would be the one that you can see in a parthood model, for example, right? You have the part, and the part is kind of overlapping, fully overlapping with, you know, with the organism of the mother. But there may be also other kinds of overlap when you have like two, like say, two individualities, but they occupy, let's say, the same space in some sense, or partially occupy the same space. We can imagine such scenarios. So how do you imagine this overlap exactly? Is it like a kind of merging, actually merging of these two individualities, or there is just one individuality? That's something that is still here quite unclear to me. How many, you know, the basic question, like how many individuals do we have in this scenario? Okay, thank you so much again, Emma.
Yeah, so I'll do the second one first. So here I'm arguing for proper overlap, which is not complete overlap. So there's a part of the foster which does not overlap with part of the gravid, or any part of the gravitas, right? So it's separate. And that implies that there are two entities overlapping. Because, yeah, from, we can go back. The diagram. It's this one. So proper overlap implies two. And in terms of which bits of the foster are not tolerated, there's tolerated and then there's compatible, right? So there are lots of bits of the foster which are not tolerated just in virtue of the immune system of the gravida not interacting with it, being shielded from it. And then there's the other kind of counterfactual claim, which is that if the immune system of the gravida did interact with these parts, like the central nervous system of the foster, for example, it would be rejected by it. And in order to make those counterfactual claims, we go to pathological cases where we see fetal loss because of immune rejection, because the these kind of immune, the syncytial trophoblast, or the barriers which restrict immune exchange, are broken or dysfunctional.
Okay, we have a lot of questions, so let's try to keep them like short and sweet if we can.
Okay. I had two, but I'll try and make them both short and sweet. Oh, so sorry. So the first one was just in response to Teresa. You made the point that, you know, the brain has its own kind of specialized immune system, etc. So I just want to know what you would say in response to someone who said, well, look, I do think the fetus is a part of the maternal organism. In virtue of that, the fetus's immune system counts as one of the maternal organism's specialized immune systems. And so that immune system's toleration of the fetal, all of the fetus, counts as the maternal organism's immune system tolerating the fetus. Well, it's a question about the individuation of immune systems. And then the other thing was just about, so you have this stronger argument, right, based on this idea of even compatibility. But I guess I'm wondering what work exactly that is doing, because so you began with this if and only if claim, you know, well, something's a part if and only if it's tolerated. So if you still hold on to that, then that delivers the verdict that these things that aren't actively tolerated by the maternal organism's immune system aren't parts of it, the maternal organism. And it's not, if that's already delivered, it's not clear why the lack of compatibility kind of adds anything. So it might be that there's a different if and only if claim that actually you want to endorse that somehow involves both claims about toleration and compatibility, but I couldn't see exactly what that claim was. So they're the two questions.
Okay, so I think they're basically the same question. The reason why compatibility is important is because you can't say that the immune system of the foster is just another specialized immune system of the gravida. That's the extra work that it does. Because if we have the principle that all parts of, well, all parts of the organism are compatible with at least some part of the immune system, then you could potentially have this view that the pre-pregnant organism, the red bit, and the foster, the blue bit, then compose a higher level organism, which includes both of those immune systems, right? But you can't have the view that the blue bit is a part of the red bit, because there are bits of the blue bit which are not compatible with any bit of the red bit. You could have a third organism. Yes, that is possible. But you cannot have that third organism as being identical to the red bit or the blue bit. So the red, like we'll talk about fallacies of decomposition in a minute, but you can't make that identity claim, right? Because the red bit cannot acquire the blue bit as a part, immunologically speaking, because there are parts of the blue bit which are not compatible with parts of the red bit. So yes, there is a potential view where there are three organisms, but I don't like it, and so I haven't mentioned it.
Can I go? Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I apologize for being a little bit late. So I agree that pretty much everything you said follows from the principle that the immune system of an organism tolerates all and only the parts of the organism to which the immune system belongs. But what exactly is the motivation for taking this as an absolute principle and not just thinking, well, this is normally the case, except in cases like pregnancy, where it evolved to tolerate something so that it can have it inside the organism.
So you could make pregnancy an exception to the rule, but then it seems a bit, it doesn't seem like a legitimate move to make it an exception to the rule in order that we have a part view, right? So then what is the motivation for creating this exception? The principle just is kind of an accepted principle within immunology. So it's insofar as we take immunology to hold these principles. So it is contingent on that, yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's just an assumption. It's just this is what immunologists do in terms of how they make part whole claims. Insofar as we take that to be our guide, this is the only thing that we can land on. So it's just in response to Elterline says this on the back of a similar kind of structured argument. I'm just saying that if we follow that structure of the argument in more immunological detail, we come up with a different mereological model.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. So my question was going to be about the symmetry argument, because you said at times that the brain had its own immune system, for example, and so my question is like, why do we say that the symmetry argument applies to the fetus but not to the brain? If you do you see the concern? I think that relates to your answer to I've forgotten who asked the question, but where you said that the red part and the
Yeah.
blue part couldn't. I think I'd always been assuming that when we were talking about the gravida, we were talking about the red part and the blue part. So maybe my question is am I right that your answer to the symmetry thing is going to be what you just said about the red and the blue parts?
Yeah.
And if so, why can you say why you reject the gravida is an organism that involves the red and the blue parts?
So when I use, so for gravida, I'm just referring to the red. And then for the foster, I'm referring to the blue. And whether the blue is part of the red is the kind of substantial question. Right, so in this case, the blue is part of the red. In this case, the blue and the red are disjoint. And in this case, the blue and the red overlap. In the case of the blood-brain barrier, the blood-brain barrier and the barrier between uterus and placenta are not the same. Immunologically, they're not the same. Anatomically, they're not the same. And traffic across them is not the same. But from a symmetry point of view, like forget the immunology, from a symmetry point of view, right, it isn't so weird to say that your brain and the rest of your body compose through mutual interaction you, right? If the gravida and the foster compose something which is neither the gravida nor the foster, because you're not just your brain or just your body, then who is it? There's potential kind of sui generis third organism on the table here, which I specifically don't kind of talk about because this is what I'm interested in is, Alex gets pregnant with foster. What is the mereological relationship between Alex and their foster?
I don't think so. We only have like 2 minutes left and we're already over time. So do you want to ask your question if you can be quick about it?
Thank you. It was beautiful. So I know the literature from Prado when it comes to biological individuality, and I believe that what you do is brilliant when it comes to understanding how this network of immune systems work. And in this case, I agree, there is overlap. But how do you count organisms in the sense that you end up with a part of the foster, so you identify a foster, but you don't identify the foster only with its immune system, I guess, but also as, like maybe meritopologically self-connected entity. So it might be the case that they overlap when it comes to the immune network, but this meritopologically self-connected entity that you place inside of the body of the gravida, whether it is apart or connected, it's another story, is another entity. So my question is, how do you count organism, and how the debate that Prado brought when it comes to biological individuality through immunology is related to your beautiful argument?
Yeah, okay, so So one thing that Prado doesn't particularly do is tell us how do we individuate immune systems, right? So he just says there is an immune system, and everything that interacts with the immune system is kind of part of the same organism. So you take an immune system, you see what it tolerates, and then you put all of those pieces together, and there's your organism. And he doesn't specifically talk about the notion of compatibility because his immunological theory is actually quite different from standard immunology. So my departure from Prado is that I'm not endorsing his theory of immunology because I think it's wrong. I'm saying that if we just use the immunology that everybody else uses, but everybody also agrees with Prado that tolerance equals parenthood, at least within the immunology community, then this is the kind of thing that we end up with. And it includes this notion of compatibility because transplantation is such a kind of core discipline within immunology. And it's this notion that there are bits of, like, an organism is entirely internally compatible with all of its other bits. You can move things around within the organism. And within a pregnant organism, you can't move things around in the same way. Specifically, there are some bits of the foster which are potentially tolerated by all parts of the gravida. That's why you can get things like microchimerism. And there are some parts of the foster which are not tolerated by any part of the gravida. So there are some bits of the foster which will not allow for microchimerism, but some bits will, right? So it's just about making that distinction in parts and what kind of mereology should that lead to. In terms of counting, I mean, it's kind of convenient that proper overlap gives you a count of 2. But otherwise, the counting problem, I just take from Prado. I haven't really disagreed with any of what he says on that.
All right, let's thank Arjun.